Good morning. We finished in chapter 14 today, reading about Paul's admonitions to the people of the church of Corinth and in ways they worship and in their welcoming of others. And yesterday we kind of concluded with verse 20 where he says, "But be in your thinking, adults." To be grown up in your thinking and in your regard for others, and not not being self-centered, not being childlike in your relationships with others. I mean, to be we are come to God as a child, totally trusting and fully believing. But we're relationships with others. We're continuing to hear now what Paul is saying to the people of the church, and so he says, in your adults, be thinking people. And then he quotes from Isaiah when he says, "In the law it's written, by people of strange tongues and the lips of foreigners, I will speak to this people, yet even then they will not listen to me." And, so Paul is remembering that through Isaiah, God said that my people, Israel, aren't going to listen to my prophets, but maybe they will listen. Maybe they will hear through the words of foreigners, of others. And so Paul is speaking to this group in Corinth who are mostly not of Jewish faith, and reminding them that it's the strange tongues that God comes and God leads others to faith that way. And then, I don't know, these next few verses are, I can't quite get around how it says it, because first he says, "Tongues then are not a sign for believers, but for unbelievers." So if you leave out a little bit, it says, "Tongues are for believers." And then it says, "Prophecy is not for unbelievers, but for believers." So you leave out that "but," it's prophecy is for believers. And then he says, "If the whole church speaks in tongues and outsiders come, they'll say you're out of your mind." But he just got done saying that tongues are for believers or for non-believers. And then he says that, tongues will confuse the unbelievers, and that prophecy is for the non-believers. But then he says that, if you're speaking in prophecy, the believers won't. I mean, I can't quite figure that out unless I need to read a few different translations and get to that. But in so many ways, especially in our society today, speaking in tongues and speaking in prophecy, I think they're more confusing to most people and intimidating to a lot of people than anything else. And I think that when we talk about God and when we share our faith, we need to be straightforward and just down to earth. And it's like I commented as I was reading, I think I commented here, and anyway, that as I was reading a commentary the other day, this person was using, again, words that I didn't know, words that were, I think he used gobbledygook in it, and it's, really? But he was using words that didn't make sense in the context of what he was saying, to me anyway, or words that I wasn't sure of how I should look at it. So Paul, I think, is saying that, sometimes when we speak in tongues, sometimes when we speak in prophecy, sometimes when we put on airs or think that we're better or, want to show our faith by whatever, kind of hold our heads up and say, look at me, it's not about me. And it's not about you. It's about God. It's about Jesus. And on Monday, when we look at chapter 15, tomorrow's Sunday, so we'll worship at Mabel at 9, and so on Monday morning, I'll combine tomorrow and Monday's readings, and chapter 15, he starts talking about, the resurrection of Jesus and the reason that we gather. And so Paul has been leading up to this in, chapter 12, I'll show you a more excellent way. Chapter 13, love is patient, love is kind. Being a part of church, being a part of God's family is accepting others, knowing that we're not perfect, knowing all of these things, and yet not being a stumbling block for anybody else either, but to be compassionate and to be welcoming. And in verse 26, he's talking about this tongues and prophecies, which I can't make sense of as of that paragraph in there. You know, it seems to me that he says one thing and then says the other. But in verse 26, he says, what shall be done? When you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, or interpretation. Let all things done for the building up. Or some verses might say edifying. And again, edifying is one of those words that a lot of people, what does edify mean? Well, it means to build up, you know. And, you know, and then he says, if anyone speaks in tongues, let there only be 2 or 3 at most, and each one in turn. And he says, but they must be interpreted. It doesn't do any good if speaking in tongues isn't interpreted. It doesn't make one bit of sense. It is just like missionaries. I mean, our missionaries go to other countries where they speak a different language, and it wouldn't do any good at all for me to go to a country that speaks only Spanish and I speak only English, and for me to go there and talk like I am today about God, about Jesus, about the Bible in English when no one can understand a word I say. You need to have an interpreter. And it's just, I mean, you see people doing sign language, you know, because it doesn't do anybody any good if they can't hear it in their own language, if they can't see it in their own language. So hearing and seeing is important. And that's the way it is with the Word of God, you know, and just speaking in tongues without an interpreter, it does absolutely no good. You know, he says, if there's no one there to interpret your speaking in tongues, stay silent and go and speak to God in private in your tongues, because he said earlier that speaking in tongues is talking to God, or maybe God speaking through you is what another interpretation of speaking in tongues is that a lot of people believe that when they speak in tongues, it is God speaking through them. But again, Paul says, if nobody is there to interpret that, what good does it do? Absolutely none. Absolutely none. And, you know, and he says if a revelation is made by someone, let the first person be silent. You can all be prophesying. I mean, he's talking about, I don't really know for sure. But if we don't, I mean, in our Lutheran churches, I mean, most of us, you know, if someone was to shout an amen, brother, during the middle of my sermon, it's kind of everybody else would look, oh, what's going on here, you know? I mean, we don't all speak up in church. We don't all have these revelations. And I've had people ask me, well, what would happen if I was to ask you a question in the middle of your sermon, Pastor? You know? And honestly, I don't know. I would hope that I would try to answer that question and not get off base from where I wanted my sermon to go. I don't know. But, you know, pretty much, I mean, we are pretty silent in church, unless we're supposed to partake in a hymn or a song or a response or something. We don't all speak. I mean, and that's part of what Paul is saying here. Make sure your worship is orderly. Doesn't do any good if you got 4 or 5 people talking at the same time. I mean, you sit at a table and there's this group on your right that's talking and the group on your left is talking and you're kind of in the middle and you hear a little here and you hear a little bit there and you're confused. You don't know what's going on either place. You have to focus your attention someplace. And you can't follow 2 or 3 conversations at the same time. It's just really, really, really hard because you're going to miss something here that's important while you listen here, or you're going to miss something over here that's important while you're trying to listen over here. I mean, your mind can't process that. So I think Paul is saying, keep your worship orderly. Keep it so that it's informing, inviting, welcoming, making people understand their need to believe in this God. The next thing he talks about, I don't even want to go there. He says, women, be quiet in church. Don't say anything in church. Well, this is one of the places that many people will come and they say we cannot have female pastors. Now, I don't have anything against female pastors. I don't have anything against female Sunday school teachers or female school teachers. And it's always seemed kind of contradictory to me that some denominations exclude women from so many different roles within their worship and within their church, but yet they're the primary Sunday school teachers, they're the primary catechism leaders, they're the primary, so many leaders in that way, but yet they can't preach, they can't. I mean, some churches, a woman couldn't even vote in the matters of the church until not so long ago. And I mean, Paul talks about in marriage that we are equal. You know, husbands obey your wives, wives obey your husbands. Well, I mean, we are a part of the family of God, and this comment in here was from a truly patriarchal society, but yet other places Paul commends the women who are leaders in the church. So again, take this one a little bit with a grain of salt, but because I truly believe that women have every right to speak and to believe, and to be honest, in an awful lot of churches in today's society, the women are the ones that make sure it keeps going. And we men need women in our lives and in our churches and in all things. And I'm just going to end this section today with the very last thing Paul says in chapter 14. He says, all things should be done decently and in order. All things should be done decently and in order. Being considerate of others, not interrupting, not making sure that not having to have your own way, as is one of the qualities of love or characteristics of love, but doing everything in order for the glory of God.